Hey everyone, it's your guy back with another deep dive today. We're talking about something that sounds ridiculously simple, but is absolutely everything for certain nations. Ships. For an island, no ships. You might as well be locked inside your own house with the doors bolted and the windows boarded up. No way out, no way in, no way to live. Sounds basic, right? But think deeper. For island nations and peninsular countries, the ocean isn't just some nice scenery for postcards. It's their natural fortress, their first line of defense, and even more than that, it's the very lifeline of their national survival, economic health, and long-term development. Without ships, they don't just lose trade, they lose their connection to the rest of the human race. Let's rewind the clock way back in prehistoric times. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands were already paddling dugout canoes into the deep blue ocean to fish, to explore, and to connect with neighboring islands. Since ancient times, coastal populations everywhere have naturally used boats to cross seas, trade goods, exchange culture, and move people and supplies across vast distances. And all of that human activity, bottom line, completely depends on one foundational industry: shipbuilding, fishing, shipping, port trade, naval power. None of it works without a shipbuilding industry sitting right underneath it, holding the whole thing up. You and I simply cannot picture a human society without ships. And we definitely cannot imagine how human history would have even played out if boats had never been invented. It's like trying to imagine the internet without servers. It just doesn't work. For an island country, a ship isn't just transportation. It carries the heavy burden of keeping the nation's supply lines, food imports, energy shipments, and economic arteries wide open. That's why, when these nations get strong enough, they fight tooth and nail to keep shipbuilding firmly in their own hands, rather than depending on foreigners who might cut them off. Take the Netherlands in the 17th century, a classic example that every American student should know from world history. Now, the Dutch weren't a true island. They're on the European mainland. But their whole national existence revolved around the sea, and their national fate was tied directly to navigation, maritime trade, and shipbuilding. They were famously called the sea coachmen of the world, with commercial fleets covering every major ocean on the planet. The Dutch East India Company and West India Company generated absolutely massive trade demand, with merchant ships crisscrossing the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific, hauling spices, tea, silk, sugar, and silver back to Europe by the shipload, weaving a global trade network that was unprecedented in human history. In 1670, the total tonnage of Dutch merchant ships hit 568,000 tons. That was nearly half of all European merchant tonnage combined at that time. That insane volume of trade lit a raging fire under Dutch shipbuilding. And their shipyards could crank out vessels at crazy efficiency, most famously the flute ship design, which became their trademark and gave them a massive competitive edge. Now, shift our gaze eastward across the world to our little neighbor Japan. And I say little with a smirk, because we all know how that turned out. For Japan, an island nation sitting off the coast of mainland Asia, shipbuilding isn't optional. It's literally a survival requirement, no joke. Otherwise, how do you even fight a naval war against the Korean Peninsula or defend yourself against any power that comes across the sea? By the middle of the 19th century, the Western Industrial Revolution was absolutely roaring at full blast. Factories exploding in size, railways spreading like wildfire, and finance, shipping, and international trade reaching heights that nobody had ever seen before. Cities were flooded with workers pouring into factories and offices by the millions. And suddenly, the demand for nighttime lighting went through the roof. Electricity hadn't been widely deployed yet. It was still a novelty, so there was this lighting fuel that most folks today don't even think about: whale oil. And let me tell you, the United States, in particular, burned through tons of it. Our streetlights, factories, office lamps, even some lighthouses, all depended on whale oil. To secure a steady, reliable supply, the US and other European powers kept expanding their whaling ranges farther and farther into the Pacific, and the Northern Pacific became a prime hunting ground. That, in turn, created huge pressure on the US government to pry open Japan's closed, isolationist markets, because Japan sat right in the middle of prime whaling territory and refused to play ball. So in 1853, U.S. Navy Commodore Matthew Perry steamed into Japan's Edo Bay with 4 warships of the East India Squadron. And that show of force eventually forced the Treaty of Kanagawa, or what the Japanese dramatically called the Black Ship's arrival. From that point on, the Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled Japan for over 200 years, was on a one-way road to collapse. those American warships. With their dark anti-corrosion paint, steam-powered engines, and heavy cannons that could sail against the wind no matter the weather, left a deep psychological scar on the Japanese population and leadership. That overwhelming show of technological and military pressure without even firing a single major shot effectively ended Japan's 2-century-long isolation policy in one fell swoop. After that massive wake-up call, Japan developed a completely new understanding of the ocean and the shipbuilding industry. The ruling elite finally realized that in the 19th century, land armies were important, sure, but modern warships capable of blue water navigation and armed with advanced artillery were what would truly decide Japan's fate as an independent nation. Japanese intellectuals saw it clearly too. The reason Western powers could cross entire oceans and show up in East Asia with such ease was fundamentally because they had powerful shipbuilding industries and formidable navies backing them up. So, after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan made up its mind once and for all. No national strength without shipbuilding. If you can't build ships, right, everything else, army, industry, economy, is just empty talk. After all, you can't sail a wooden sailing ship against steam-powered ironclads. And samurai spirit sure as hell won't stop naval artillery shells. So they got the mindset, right? Did the ideological work rallied society behind the cause? But then came the big practical question that every developing nation faces. Where do we go to learn this stuff? Naturally from Europe. Once that path was set, Japan's shipbuilding industry carried a heavy military footprint from day one. It was never about building nice passenger liners or fishing boats. In the final years of the shogunate, the Japanese government started building modern shipyards at strategic locations like Yokosuka, bringing in Dutch, French, and British engineers to teach them how to build steam-powered ships from scratch. And you can't just build ships. You also need metallurgy, machining, casting, forging, and all the supporting industrial technologies that go with it. Because Japan had long maintained contact with the Dutch during the shogunate era. They were the only Europeans allowed to trade in Japan for centuries, and had absorbed some Dutch studies that gave them a taste of early naval technology. The Netherlands was the first choice for tech transfer. But by that time, the Dutch had already fallen behind the top tier of maritime powers. They weren't the force they used to be, the rising French Second Empire. Under Napoleon III was much more to Japan's taste and ambition. A French consular official based in Ningbo, Li-Once-Verney, was brought in at the shogunate's request to design and build the Yokosuka naval arsenal from the ground up. Transplanting Western dry docks, machining, casting, and even organizational methods wholesale into Japan. Verney stayed for nearly a decade, and gradually Japan developed the capability to systematically produce modern warships on its own. But here's the key point that Americans need to understand. The driving logic behind Japan's shipbuilding development was always military, never civilian. Every bit of technology, every innovation, every factory expansion had to serve naval requirements first and foremost. A large number of young Japanese were sent to schools and universities to study math, mechanics, ship design, and navigation, while at the same time, iron smelting, coal mining, machining, and gun casting were gradually localized with Japanese hands. Almost all the early major shipyards were tied directly to the Imperial Japanese Navy, and many were state-run military facilities from day one. The most advanced technology, the best equipment, and the brightest talent were reserved for warships first. Civilian ships got the leftovers. Back then, the measure of Japan's shipbuilding success was brutally simple and unforgiving. Can we win a naval battle or not? That military above all model was especially obvious in the late 19th century. After the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, Japan realized that just buying warships from foreign countries, mostly from Britain, was no longer enough to satisfy its expansionist ambitions on the Asian mainland. Then the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 gave it another massive push forward. Before that war, Japan could build some smaller vessels, but most of its main force battleships, especially the big ones, were still built in British shipyards, and steam turbines and large naval guns still had to be imported from overseas at great expense. To cope with the demands of a full-scale war against a European power, the Japanese government flooded both state-run and private shipyards with emergency orders, which effectively helped companies like Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, and others grow into full-fledged zaibatsu, those giant industrial conglomerates that would dominate Japan's economy for decades. Gotta give credit where it's due, the post-Meiji modernization was pretty damn successful by any measure. Once the Battle of Tsushima was won in 1905 Japan, As the first Asian country in modern history to defeat a European power, Tsarist Russia, in a major naval war, scored a victory that went far beyond the military dimension. After the First Industrial Revolution, European powers had an absolute edge in military industry, technology, and naval power, colonizing almost all of Asia and Africa, and the belief that white nations are invincible was deeply ingrained in global consciousness. Japan, an eastern latecomer that had been pried open by American black ships just 50 years earlier, defeating a European power in a large-scale modern war for the first time. The public narrative naturally read that as definitive proof of the Meiji Restoration success story. As a major pillar of that restoration, Japan's navy and shipbuilding industry gained even more government support and funding, and society as a whole gained much more confidence in heavy industry, steel production, and shipbuilding as career paths. After that naval victory, Japanese newspapers heaped nonstop praise on the Navy and the shipbuilding sector. Places like Yokosuka, Kure, and Sasebo were celebrated as sacred symbols of national power and pride, and the status of naval engineers, designers, and technical personnel reached heights never seen before in Japanese history. World War I further reinforced this trajectory in a big way. At that time, the Japanese Navy was almost an independent political force unto itself, with its own agenda and ambitions, and it effortlessly grabbed German colonial holdings in East Asia, including the final signing of the 21 demands against China and the German Micronesian territories north of the equator, which became Japanese mandates. With these gains in hand, the Navy extracted from the cabinet in Tokyo a military budget twice the size of the Army's allocation, and poured massive amounts of money straight back into shipbuilding research, expansion, and production. You could honestly say that Japanese shipbuilding and overseas colonial expansion were welded together with the same rivets. Every single link in the industrial chain, from the smallest part supplier to the biggest dockyard, became a driver and supporter of aggressive expansion. But here's the old saying that everyone should remember: you keep winning, and eventually you'll lose and lose big. In World War II, the warships churned out by Japanese shipyards at great expense ended up getting absolutely thrashed by the US Navy in the Pacific Theater. The sinking of the Shinano aircraft carrier at Kure, a massive ship that was converted from a battleship hull, was practically the last shovel of dirt on the grave of Japanese militarism. If the Japanese had taken the Russo-Japanese victory as confirmation of their Meiji-era path and shipbuilding strategy, then by that same brutal logic, the defeat in WWE was the death sentence for that entire old playbook. So the old military LEDD logic had to be thrown out the window, and they needed a new teacher, a new model to follow. Japan has always learned from whoever is strongest. In the late shogunate, it was Britain and France, after WW proved America's overwhelming dominance in every conceivable way. It was time to learn from the United States, lock, stock, and barrel. From a certain angle, and I'm not exaggerating here, America's victory in the Pacific War was, in itself, a victory of shipbuilding and industrial mobilization more than anything else, at its peak. American naval shipyards and private yards could simultaneously build at least 17 270-meter class capital ships, and 12 of those exceeded 300 meters in overall length, with a rock-solid supply chain, unlimited funding from Congress, and an unstoppable workforce. The U.S. Navy achieved unprecedented construction efficiency that the world had never seen before and has rarely seen since. The USS Essex was built in 31 months, the USS Midway in 22 months, and on average, an Essex-class fleet carrier was launched in under 20 months from keel laying to commissioning. That kind of breakneck pace was absolutely unmatched by any other country on the planet, including Japan, Germany, or Britain. We literally buried the enemy under a tidal wave of steel. After the war ended, Japan caught another windfall thanks to Uncle Sam's deep pockets and strategic needs, because the Korean Peninsula broke out in open conflict in 1950. After WWE, Daniel Ludwig, an American shipping magnate with a nose for opportunity, and his National Bulk Carriers Company, not satisfied with the conditions at the welding shipyard back in the States, signed an agreement with Japanese authorities in 1951 to lease the old Kure Naval Arsenal, the very yard that had built the battleship Yamato and the carrier Shinano, which perfectly met their needs for building massive oil tankers to feed the global oil boom. At Kure, they quickly rolled out a series of record-breaking supertankers that stunned the shipping world. In 1958, the Billy Warrenson Apollo hit the water as the world's first ship exceeding 100,000 deadweight tons. Ludwig built a grand total of 42 ships at Kure, and most of them were the world's largest vessels at the time of their delivery. After the lease expired, Kure was acquired by ISA, but ISA kept building tankers for Ludwig's companies for years afterward. What American firms like Ludwig's brought to Japan's post-war shipbuilding was the American way of doing things, widespread adoption of the prefabricated welding and assembly line techniques that had been used during W.E.'s frantic Liberty ship and Victory ship, rushed before W.E. Ships were mostly riveted on site, piece by piece, plate by plate, which was extremely time-consuming and limited how many workers you could use at any one time. Large prefabricated modules solved that problem brilliantly, moving the work from inside the cramped hull to dedicated open assembly areas and letting far more workers labor simultaneously on different sections to meet surging trans-Pacific and transatlantic shipping demand after the war. The U.S. Maritime Commission also actively promoted standardized ship designs like the Liberty and Victory classes. American engineers broke down an entire ocean, going vessel into hundreds of prefabricated modules, hull sections, decks, boiler rooms, bows, sterns, even piping systems, and living quarters. All built in advance at specialized factories and then transported to the main dock for final assembly like a giant three-dimensional puzzle. By the 1960s, Japan had refined and improved this method far beyond U.S. wartime standards, building large tankers and bulk carriers cheaper, faster, and with better quality control, and eventually outcompeting many established European and American shipyards to become the world's #1 shipbuilding power for decades. On top of that physical technology, America taught Japan another crucial industrial concept that changed everything: statistical process control, or SPC. The core idea was brutally simple but powerful. Industrial processes can never be perfectly reliable. Every single product will have natural variations in size, material strength, chemical composition, you name it. Some variation is inherent to the process itself, but most deviations from the ideal can be traced to specific identifiable causes. And if you find those causes, you can eliminate them at the root. That required constantly analyzing deviations throughout the entire production process, making industrial assembly more reliable, more predictable, and cutting waste and rework drastically. Before that, Japan's shipbuilding system, though technically competent and skilled, was heavily rooted in traditional craftsmanship, relying on veteran master technicians to fix problems by feel and experience, adjusting things on the spot as issues came up, with loose time management and poorly standardized handoffs between different stages of work. That old school model worked fine for small scale, custom production. But as volume grew and global competition intensified, efficiency tanked fast. American industrial know-how brought Japan unprecedented success in shipbuilding, but it also, ironically, planted the seeds for its later decline because it created a dependency on mass production that would become a liability. Japan's big shipyards, Mitsubishi, Mitsui Kawasaki, and others, took the build ships like cars philosophy and commercialized and civilianized it to the absolute extreme, constantly compressing production cycles, cutting costs to the bone. And chasing ever higher volumes in the mid-20th century, globalization took off like a rocket, world trade expanded at a breakneck pace that nobody had predicted, and the global economy was absolutely thirsty for massive numbers of tankers and bulk carriers to move oil, grain, iron ore, and manufactured goods across oceans. Japan supplied the world with speed, reliability, and low cost. And for a while, it looked like they could do no wrong. But once the global shipping market inevitably changed, and markets always change, this system showed its deep rigidity and lack of flexibility. The 1973 oil crisis hit like a sledgehammer, shipping demand nosedived almost overnight, and orders for giant tankers evaporated into thin air. The massive capacity that Japanese yards had just spent years expanding suddenly became a crushing financial burden. Many yards were still optimized for building standardized giant tankers and struggled like hell to pivot to more diverse, smaller batch, more specialized orders that required different skills and different designs, American-style industrial management, while boosting efficiency in good times. Also reinforced a path dependency in Japan's heavy industry on scale above all. Companies kept expanding docks, pushing tonnage higher, chasing record output at any cost, forming what the Japanese themselves called a heavy, thick, long, large industrial structure that was as inflexible as concrete. That structure was incredibly effective during high-growth boom periods. But once growth slowed down to a crawl, fixed costs were so astronomically high that any meaningful drop in orders would eat up all the profits just keeping the giant yards running and the lights on. The WW American Liberty ship system was essentially a wartime mobilization model, great for short-term surges and emergencies, but not necessarily suited for long-term stable competition in peacetime markets. By the 1970s and 1980s, when South Korea rose to prominence with its own aggressive shipbuilding push, Japan suddenly found that its rivals not only had cheaper labor costs, but could also copy the very same industrialized methods that Japan had learned from the US decades earlier. The methods Japan relied on for its survival had no inherent, irreplaceable technological moat. Anyone with enough capital and determination could replicate them. And you know what they say in the business world? What goes around comes around, and payback is a bitch. Then came the 1990s, and Japan's domestic bubble economy burst with a deafening crash. The start of that dreaded lost 30 years that we still read about in the financial press today. The Japanese started having serious second thoughts about everything they had built. Shipbuilding. Build what ships? Is it even worth building ships anymore in this new global order? If the 1970s oil crisis was just a hard break, then the rise of the Chinese and South Korean shipbuilding industries after the 1990s was like someone ripping the steering wheel right out of Japan's hands and driving off with it. The Koreans copied the standardized assembly playbook lock, stock, and barrel, and with unlimited government backing and chaebol financing, they threw money at it without counting the cost, pushing scale and capacity to new, dizzying heights, right on their heels. China joined the game with even greater national scale, cheaper labor by an order of magnitude, and an incredible learning curve that stunned the industry. Facing this double squeeze from both Korea and China on two sides, you'd think Japanese shipyards would have rushed to upgrade their technology tree, pivoting hard to high value added, highly specialized, tech-intensive vessels like LNG carriers, cruise ships, and advanced naval vessels. But here came the fatal problem again. Years of relying on the build ships like Carr's mass production model had made corporate decision-making dangerously rigid, risk-averse, and slow during those 30 long years of economic stagnation. The first reaction of Japan's shipbuilding executives to the crisis wasn't innovation or bold investment. It was defensive cost-cutting, layoffs, and retrenchment. To keep profits on paper as orders shrank, big yards started massive layoffs, forced mergers and reorganizations, and slashed research and development budgets to the absolute bone. Even more bizarrely and short-sightedly, they not only forced out a large number of skilled workers and engineers who were still in their prime working years, but also cut off the pipeline of fresh young talent coming in from universities and technical schools. And guess what happened next? Those same people, with all their hard-won experience and technical knowledge, turned around and were hired as high-paid technical consultants by Korean and Chinese yards eager to absorb Japanese expertise. Japan's brilliant cost-cutting and efficiency drive ended up handing its hard-earned technical experience straight to its competitors on a silver platter. Sure, Japan later tried to claw back some ground in high-end segments like LNG carriers and advanced cruise ships. But the massive system built for mass production was already too entrenched, too bureaucratic, and too slow to turn around on a dime. Look at Japan today with your own eyes. People are still using fax machines and flip phones in many offices. Corporate seniority and promotion by age is extreme. Response to new digital technologies and automation is painfully slow, and their almost religious blind faith in lean management and just-in-time production made them stumble badly when facing the new global wave of digital shipbuilding. AI-assisted design, and eco-friendly new energy vessels that the world is demanding. At the same time, that once proud craftsmanship spirit that they exported as a global brand, faced with a severe aging population, declining birth rates, and young people who have absolutely zero interest in dirty, noisy factory work, has completely run out of steam and become a hollow slogan, from the Meiji-era military path to the post-war American-style mass production frenzy to the defensive conservative retreat during the lost 30 years. Japan's shipbuilding saga is a perfect, unflinching mirror of the country's modern national fate, its rise, its peak, and its slow decline. The ocean gave this island nation its original lifeline for survival and expansion, but uniformity, complacency, and deep-seated conservatism, in the end, slowly made them surrender the top shipbuilding crown in the vast, unforgiving ocean of global competition. And as Americans, we should watch that story carefully, because the same industrial complacency can happen to anyone, even us, if we're not paying attention. All right, that's the full deep dive for today.